Hey, Dante. So, how's it going, guys? Pretty good? Did everyone get an email from me? A personalized email and then a general email? Personalized email about your grades and then a general one talking about, okay. All right, good. All right, so your first essay is completely taken care of. And at this point now, we're finishing up metaphysics. So we've already looked at two big topics in metaphysics. The first big topic in metaphysics we looked at is the one that's most culturally relevant, is the one of God. Almost every civilization and every culture in history has believed in divinity of some kind, some sort of deity. So that's why I prioritize that. It's one of those big questions that contribute to these ideas of where did we come from, why are we here, and where are we going. So that's why we put God first. And then we moved on to another metaphysical issue, the mind-body problem. Now, why are those both metaphysical issues? Well, because if the physical is just what appears, then the metaphysical is that which does not appear, is invisible, can't be sensed, or is in some sense beyond the physical, right? So God is clearly, in many respects, beyond the physical, is metaphysical. Same with mind, right? Unless you're a materialist, the mind is beyond the apparent. Now, the topic we're about to enter now, the last metaphysical topic, is the problem of free will. And roughly speaking, this is metaphysics because science alone cannot tell us whether or not we have free will or we don't have free will. This is the kind of thing that is metaphysical because no matter what understanding of physics you have, that understanding of physics is not sufficient to determine whether or not there's some agent who is independently determining his own actions, or whether either there is no agent or this agent itself is fully determined by other events and causes in nature. So science, as we're about to get into today, science is amazingly impotent in this respect. Science is great at collecting facts, generating data, interpreting data, and doing experiments, choosing between different educated guesses, also known as hypotheses. Science is great at that, but designing an experiment which will test whether or not you have free will has never been done. There are experiments that might suggest that even though your actions look like they come after some conscious decision, that actually the consciousness part is delayed. It comes a bit later after the action. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. There is some neuroscience that suggests that your muscles and your nerves are already primed for action before you're aware of it. Now, if the order is switched, right? If the action is already beginning to happen or primed to act before you're aware of it, that might undermine the idea that you're causing it, right? That would suggest that there's some unconscious activity going on, and that's what's really doing the work, and your consciousness is just a kind of byproduct or after effect. But we'll save that for next class, where we're going to go directly into the problem of free will. We're going to look at an essay by an American philosopher called Chisholm, and we're going to analyze that essay because it does a really good job of articulating the main issues in the free will problem. But what we're going to do now is we're going to do a preliminary exercise by studying a great philosopher called David Hume. He was a Scottish philosopher, and he was part of the Enlightenment. And this guy is just a great, great philosopher. The reason why I put him so high on a pedestal, guys, is because of two things. One, He had the acuity, the acumen, he had the aptitude to really analyze problems really, really well intellectually. So he was a great thinker. He really isolated issues and problems in philosophy and thought through them deeply, looking at their implications. He was excellent at that. But what's even more impressive is that he never lost his humanity, no matter how deep and philosophical his probity and his acuity became. He always remained fully human, an elegant, excellent writer, and an all-around great guy who had a reputation for being a great human being, very sweet, very thoughtful, very well composed, great temperament, always cheerful, always social. You know what I mean? One of those guys who, for whatever they go through in life, they bounce back really quickly, and for whatever social environment they enter, they fit in seamlessly. That's the model human being. And that's more important than just being an intellectual. So David Hume, to me, is a model philosopher. I mean, someone like Leibniz invented calculus. He's probably more famous than Hume. But if I were to suggest to you someone to imitate, like a model, I would place Hume above even Leibniz or Kant, for that matter. So Hume is a very civilized, cultured, humane individual. And that's the kind of philosopher we need to really talk about and use as a role model, okay? Now, we're gonna get into him for today's lesson because he's gonna talk about something that's very related to this issue of free will. If we interpret free will as something like there being this agent or this person who determines his own actions, then you can see why that concept of determining your own actions or self-determination relies on the idea of causation. Do you see that? You must be the cause of your own actions, which are kind of like effects of those causes. So maybe your thoughts or whatever are causes, and they're creating effects in your actions. Now, if that's true, we need to be very, very careful in understanding just what it is to say that one thing causes another. And Hume does an excellent analysis of this concept of cause, and that's what I had you read today. The concept of cause, guys, is not just a physical idea. I know we probably associate it with physics a lot, this idea that gravity causes bodies of a certain mass to accelerate at a certain rate. So we casually use this word cause. Gravity causes bodies to accelerate, or COVID causes flu-like symptoms, or something like what? Poverty causes crime, you know? We use this word cause very loosely and very readily. We have it ready at hand. But that's the common sense folk use of the word cause. You bring a philosopher in and a thinker, and he's going to test the rigor with which we use this and our entitlement to use it the way we do. So we're going to get to that in a bit. But before we get there, I want us to finish up with a concept that was in the introduction notes that we've been trying to get through all semester. Now is a really good time to get through it because, guys, if you really think about what we're about to talk about with Hume, something extremely profound is about to happen. And it's going to revolutionize philosophy. Because Kant was considered by many people the greatest philosopher in history. Kant was forced to reevaluate his entire philosophy based on what Hume is about to do right now, what we're going to analyze. It was so powerful that basically after Hume, metaphysics fell into discredit. You had two forces happening. One force was that science was becoming more and more credible, reputable, and popular. And along with this idea of science was the idea of progress, right? Science is making all this progress. We're discovering new chemical elements, new chemical compounds, new chemical substances. We've got this elegant chemical table. We've got taxonomies in biology. We're figuring out the whole animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. We're discovering new forces in physics. We're understanding the laws of motion according to Newtonian mechanics. We've got all this progress going on with the natural sciences in particular and science in general. And we've got a methodology that seems to produce results. And then we've got these old professors talking about metaphysics and God and mind, and it sounds like they're just speculating. They don't have any support for their conclusions except these scholastic arguments inherited from the medieval period, and they aren't making progress. That's the real killer. No philosopher, I hate to tell you guys, no philosopher has ever discovered any chemical element, no chemical compound. Unless you reinterpret Newton as a philosopher. And he thought of himself as a philosopher. He considered himself a natural and mathematical philosopher, right? So there is a bit of overlap and a bit of blurring and confusion between science and philosophy. But for the most part, science begins to become an independent cultural phenomenon as we enter the 17th and 18th centuries. And universities respond to that by opening up specific departments for the sciences, not philosophy, but physics, chemistry, biology, the social sciences. So there's a cultural momentum that's building. There's all this progress and it's obvious. And so those philosophy professors, they're exposed now, right? Everybody's like, look, what are you? Are you a scientist or are you not? And if you're not a scientist, then can you claim knowledge? Is there such a thing as metaphysical knowledge? And that's where the problem comes. After Hume and Kant's reaction to Hume, philosophy in the form of metaphysics, which is probably its most basic and primitive form, philosophy in that form completely goes underground. It's like discredited. All this talk about God and, Leibniz, right? Spirits and, all this speculation, it just goes underground. Hume is an empiricist. He says all of our knowledge ultimately comes from experience, and the scientific methodology is empirical in that sense. So when science joins Hume's empiricism and his skepticism about concepts like causation, the combination of those two forces locks up metaphysics. And unfortunately, a big part of metaphysics is what we started this course with, theology, right? So your new, modern, hip scientist is also, in addition to being empirical, he's also a materialist, and he's typically also a what? An atheist, typically. That's the new worldview that's emerging after the progress of science, Hume and Kant, and then also people like Charles Darwin, right? All right, so that's the environment that I'm trying to create for you to understand what's really going on here, because it's quite profound. So that's why I want us to talk a little bit about the scientific method and its roots in the Socratic method, because I think when we really talk about this at a deep, deep level, you'll have a deeper appreciation for why, despite the success of the results of science, as well as the success of the scientific method, what Hume did was so devastating that it was devastating not only to metaphysics as a cultural phenomenon, but if properly understood, it's also undermining science. But science culturally survived in a way that metaphysics didn't. And we need to discuss why science seems to survive Hume's skepticism and rigorous empiricism, whereas it seems like metaphysics just it couldn't survive, it died. So we're going to talk about the scientific method, but there are just 2 or 3 ideas I want to run by you in preparation for talking about the Socratic scientific method, all right? And that is what I'm about to share with you right now. The first concept, the first idea I want to share with you, there are 2 basic ideas I want to share with you. Just to put things into perspective, we use this word theory. What do you think we mean by the word theory? Because, to be quite frank, both science and philosophy offer theories of the world, both of them. And sometimes they compete, and in our culture, science wins. So both of them offer theories about different things in the world itself, about the origins of the world, all of that. You have philosophical and scientific theories. You have the theory of evolution. You have all sorts of theories about the atomic theory of matter, all sorts of laws that express chemical reactions and chemical compositions. You have all sorts of things like that. And when we get into science in particular, we have to be very careful about talking about the difference between facts and laws and theories and hypotheses. All of these are very technical terms that mean different things. But let's just talk about theories, whether philosophical or scientific. When you hear the word theory, what do you think? If some scientist has come up with a new theory of what matter is or what matter is composed of, or some scientist has come up with a new theory that says that the Earth goes around the sun and the sun doesn't go around the Earth. When we say he has come up with a theory, what does that mean? Yeah, go ahead.
I would say it's I would define it as an attempt to explain a certain type of phenomenon.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's an attempt to explain a certain type of phenomena by taking a certain view on it. And that view that you take on it is supposed to explain what you look at by providing the best possible interpretation of the data. So you have a bunch of data that you've gone through a bunch of experiments with, and you have a bunch of competing theories. And if you're a rational scientist, you choose the theory that makes the most elegant and fruitful and conservative and simple sense of the existing data. So first, the data has to be good. And once the data is good, the theory needs to be good enough to make sense of that data in an economical and rigorous way. So you're absolutely right. So the first word that comes to my mind when I think of theory is view. If someone has the theory that everything is made of matter, you can re-explain that as that person has the view, theory and view. Actually, theory is a Greek word and it means view. So if Aristotle has a certain theory about substances, then he has a view. That's the technical English word for it. But you know, we borrowed a bunch of words from Greek directly into English, so we borrowed the word theory directly. So the word theory is just another word for the word view. So ideally, what you do is you do a whole bunch of experiments that generate data, and then once you know the data has been vetted and it's good data, then you select the hypothesis that is going to make best sense of all the data. And if that is universal enough and homogeneous enough, and there's a consensus on that hypothesis, then it can get elevated into an actual theory. Does that make sense? All right. We're gonna go through the scientific method there. But here is what I want to kind of deflate. That sounds really good. It sounds really like bold and self-assured, like, yeah, that's how you do it, That's how you master the world. You figure stuff out by doing experiments, making educated guesses called hypotheses, and then if they survive all these tests, one day they'll get elevated in status to theories. But I want to deflate that view a little bit, just by thinking about something I want to make a metaphor or a parable, and I want to see if you agree that this throws a monkey wrench in our understanding of what a theory is. The map is not the territory. I'm going to repeat that. The map is not the territory. So what am I saying? If you have an area of land full of rich physical features, you've got slopes and valleys and all sorts of geological phenomena, rocks and stones, some marble, some quartz, some sandstone. You've got sand, you've got stratification of the sand, you've got all sorts of houses and artificial stuff, buildings, plots of land, farm, gardens, you name it. There's rich natural and cultural phenomena on this land, right? And you design a map to represent that territory. When someone says, no matter how good your map is, the map is not the territory, you should never confuse the two things. What are they reminding you? Go ahead.
It's just like, in town area, like people there, they can't really like the culture, like how they like culture.
Exactly right, man. The map is not the territory. So, yes, science can make interesting new equations, F equals ma, PV equals nRT, E equals mc squared. And sometimes we get lost in this expression or this equation or this theory, and we forget something, right? This theory helps us to process data and to process it in a very tangible, measurable way. And we get lost in that. We get spoiled by that. And the fact that it's producing results and it enables us to manipulate the world using technology, all of that spoils us and it makes us forget, hey, wait a minute. For everything that is represented in this theory and in this equation, for everything that is represented and is included, think of all the stuff that isn't. You see what I'm saying? So the map is not the territory. If someone comes up with a theory that says everything in the universe is made of matter, or everything in the universe is made of matter and energy, or E equals mc squared, or F equals ma, or I know not what, whatever they come up with, whatever formula they say is the final formula, the ultimate formula that explains everything, be very mindful that this is probably a con man who is unconscious that he's a con man. Because what he's selling you is not reality. He's selling you a map. And it does guide you to certain features of the universe, that's true. But always be mindful of what it's not representing, what's being left out. A lot of richness is being left out. You see what I'm saying? I mean, E equals mc squared is probably the most famous equation in history at this point. But how much is being said by that? Just really think about that. It's fascinating that energy and matter can transform into each other. That's baffling. Relativity is amazing. The idea that time can dilate, I mean, that blows my mind. And then, of course, quantum mechanics, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The idea that the universe is strange and weirder than we ever thought, that is supported by modern physics, by relativistic physics and quantum mechanical physics. But as weird as that is, as weird as all of that is, I want to remind you that reality is even weirder. And think about how weird it is just based on someone like the Cartesian meditations. Think about how weird it is to rethink of yourself as a soul or a mind that is not a body or an object, but a what? A set of what? You remember when we were at the second meditation? What does Descartes discover about this mind that is? Go ahead. Activity. What's weirder than that? What exists are not things or states of being or objects. What ultimately metaphysically exists is pure activity. The activity of thinking, which can be further broken down into the activities of doubt and sensing and imagination and perception and willing and denying and affirming and understanding. So whenever some impressive new formula gets circulated in our textbooks and in our mainstream media, always remind yourself, maps are excellent in themselves, but no matter how excellent the map is not the territory. Anyone who says, I am showing you the universe, is leaving out a whole bunch of stuff. You see that? Okay, that's what I want to tell you. And that's true definitely for science, because it's very mathematical, but it's also true even for philosophy, right? If Thales tells you everything is one or everything is water, I mean, first, is that even a meaningful statement? And even if it is meaningful, think about all the meaningful stuff that's left out of that statement. You see what I'm saying? There's plenty that's left out. So this idea that Einstein had, I think Einstein had a dream of unifying physics in such a way that either one formula or one set of formula could provide something like a theory of everything. But again, be mindful, whatever form that formula finally takes, it will merely be a map. The territory is full of rich phenomena that will not be captured by it. All sorts of ants and earthworms and nightingales, and you got the idea, right? Okay. The second thing I want to leave with you is the idea that one thing philosophy is about, I'm sure you detected this, is that it's about using words carefully. What we're about to see with Hume is going to be an exercise in using words very carefully and seeing what they do imply and what they don't imply. But for that, we have to take a step back and look at some of the words that are current in our culture and in our language and start investigating what these words really mean. So far in this class, we have used one word, I think, in a technical way so far, the word idea. But now we need to get really, really technical, because as we approach Hume, it's going to be clear that we need to make some very meaningful distinctions between certain things that are blurry and confused. So when you hear the word idea, what do you think of? If you say, I have an idea of God, or I have an idea of perfection, or my idea of God involves the idea of perfection. When you keep using this word idea, what is an idea? We're going to distinguish it from two other things that are very closely associated with it in our common culture, but in a philosophy class, you've got to separate them. So I want to start with the word that we've used the most, idea. We've used it with Descartes, and we've used it with Axon. We've also used it a little bit when we're talking about what a mind is. What is your idea of an idea? What is an idea? Hume is going to go directly to this word idea, and he's going to milk it for all it's got, and that's what's going to generate the problem of causation, because there's going to be an important consequence related to this word idea, and it's going to imply that our understanding of the word cause is flawed. Don't worry, we have plenty of time. That actual work of going to Hume is going to go very quickly. If we do this work now, it'll go much easier later. What comes to mind? When you think of the word idea, what comes to your mind? Go ahead, Dante.
I kind of think that it's a metaphysical activity of the mind.
Yes, very good. And that's exactly what it is. That's how I would describe it too. The name for that activity, I would suggest to you, the name that I think is best describes the activity involved in ideas is perception. All ideas are perceived. And if you're not perceiving an idea, then technically you don't have the idea or the idea doesn't exist. You see that? We are dealing, guys, with a type of philosophy known as empiricism. Empiricism claims that all knowledge comes from experience. The philosopher who invented this philosophy was known as John Locke. He wrote an essay concerning human understanding, and in this essay, he analyzed the human mind. He called it the understanding, and he broke it down in terms of how it generates knowledge. So Kant, looking back on Locke, said, hey, Kant was kind of like doing a physiology of the mind. In other words, he was looking at where experience begins and how ideas enter the mind, and then how ideas get processed from being simple ideas into complex ideas. So if you look at an apple is technically a complex idea. It's got shape, size, color, you see that? Complexity just means there are many different ideas. But all those can be analyzed into simple ideas. Redness, certain shapes, you see that? So now, Locke starts us off with empiricism. And he says, basically, there's nothing in the mind that has not come from the senses and from experience. So he is basically saying, look, he's against all those philosophers who came before him that say we are born with a soul that already has ideas in it the moment it's conceived. There are philosophers like Descartes who believe that our soul, our mind, is already full of ideas that spontaneously, innately come up inside the soul. Now, if that were true, that would make experience superfluous. You see that? You wouldn't need to experience anything because all your ideas would be self-generated. So Locke is saying, no, all ideas come from this outside source called the world. They're filtered through the senses, and then they attain a certain status within the mind. That status they have in the mind is based on the mind's metaphysical activity. And that metaphysical activity is perception. So all ideas are perceived. Hume would then build on Locke and say, in addition to the idea that all knowledge is made up of ideas in the mind that are perceived, he would also say, to clarify Locke, that all ideas come from some external impact or influence on the senses that he would call impressions. So to tell the full physiology or the full story of the journey of the idea as it's processed by the mind, there's the external world, which influences the senses a certain way, generating impressions. Those impressions are taken into the mind and attain the status of ideas that are perceived. Those ideas get analyzed and synthesized and processed into more complex ones, like apples or even God. And that's the full story of how our mind works. We generate all of our ideas out of simple ones. All right? Now, this is important because there was an intermediate philosopher in between Locke and Hume. There was one called Berkeley, and he was not only an empiricist who believed that all of our ideas come from experience, but he was also an idealist. Do you remember what idealism is? In the philosophy of mind, idealism, it's the philosophy of the theory that the only thing that exists is minds. If the only thing that exists is minds, minds, unlike matter, are completely active, right? So what minds do is they're engaged in the metaphysical activity of perception. So everything that you see is technically not an object or a thing, but an idea. Do you remember that? So as you look around you, what you see is nothing but your own mind's activity. There is nothing behind those images in your mind right now. They're not real independent things. They have no independent status or independent existence. And in fact, when you really think about it, according to Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. For something to be is just for it to be perceived. And when it's not being perceived, it has no being. It doesn't exist. That's how radical he was. So I'm just bringing this up to show you that what we mean by idea in everyday words, in everyday language, when we use this word idea, if you look at the history of philosophy, when the word idea is used at its most rigorous and technical, there the word idea is completely wedded to the idea of perception. There are no ideas without perception, and there are no perceptions without ideas. Now, there are different kinds of ideas, right? Colors, tastes, smells. Love is a kind of perception, anger. So there's the external world perceptions and also the internal psychological perceptions, all right? So that's ideas. Now I think you have a good idea of what an idea is. Now let's look at another word in our common language. What do you associate with the word concept? What is a concept? And is a concept the same as an idea or different? So if I have an apple in front of me and I look at it, I perceive it, then that perception would be an example of an idea. Give me an example of a concept. Give me an example of a concept, and then tell me what a concept is. Go ahead. Yes, it's like an explanation. Very good. So ideas are just perceptions. There's no explaining. You know what I mean? Either you see it or you don't. If you see the color red, there's no explaining to do technically. Insofar as it's an idea, either you see it and it has the quality that it does, or you don't see it and it doesn't have the quality that it does. So ideas are not explanatory. They don't explain anything. They are experienced, right? Because that's where they were born in empiricism. You experience ideas. They have a qualitative feel to them. The quality of redness, the quality of a note on a melody, the quality of anger, the quality of thirst. All those qualities are perceptions. They're ideas. Now, the idea or the perception itself doesn't do any explaining. It's just perceived or explained. But right, you might introduce a concept to explain the idea. So that's very good. Concepts have this explanatory role. When you want to explain what something is, independent of the idea, you can create a symbol, like a word. And that symbol or that word gives you the opportunity in our language, in our grammar, to explain that symbol in terms of other symbols. These are not ideas, these are not perceptions. Now we're using technology, the technology of language. What is a word? Is the map the territory? Is the word apple the same as an apple? No, you see, the map is not the territory, right? So the territory, technically, is always perception. Do you see that? That is the closest we come to territory. Now, this thing called a concept is a symbol which you can define or explain in terms of other symbols. So it's kind of like technology, right? We have all this rich phenomenological experience, and in order for us to analyze it or control it or manipulate it, we animals have invented language which gives us symbols that represent our experience, and then we can use this symbol kind of like an equation. An equation expresses one variable in terms of others. Also, a concept expresses its meaning in terms of other symbols. We call that definition, right? You define a concept. So what is a bachelor? What are the two qualities of the concept of a bachelor? A bachelor has to be two things at least. Single and? Single and? A male, yeah, a single male, an unmarried male. You see that? So bachelor is not something you ever see. You see that? A bachelor is something you understand and you define. So you might say that ideas are natural, they're psychological. Ideas are psychological perceptions. They're psychological, they're activities of the soul, metaphysical activities like Dante said. Ideas are metaphysical activities of the soul, perceptions. Whereas concepts are constructs. They are symbols that are defined in terms of other symbols. So a bachelor, the word bachelor is a concept, and you define it in terms of being unmarried and being a male. You see that? Those are two different things. Ideas are just perceptions. They don't explain or define anything. Concepts define things. You see that? And they're artificial. They're symbols. All right. I think you got that. You're going to see a crisis hit now with someone like Hume and then Kant. There's going to be a clash between concepts and what they can do, and then ideas and what they can do. People like Descartes rely heavily on concepts. People like the empiricists rely heavily on ideas. It's going to be a clash on these two approaches to what knowledge is. You see that? All right, there's one more thing I want to talk about. There's concepts, and then there's ideas, and then there's this other word we use in our everyday knowledge all the time, which is facts. What on earth is a fact? Now, we know what ideas are, we know what concepts are, and what is this mysterious thing called a fact? Is a fact the same as an idea? Is it the same as a concept, or is it something different? Go ahead.
I think a fact more I would argue that fact is more of a concept than an idea, but more than that, it assumes truth.
Yes, very good. Very, very good. Exactly. That second feature you said, that was what I was really looking for. It assumes truth. So when you perceive an idea, that idea by itself does not imply truth. Do you see that? You could be hallucinating, you could be dreaming. All of those are perceptions. You see that? The perception of an idea does not by itself imply truth. It just implies that you're engaged in a certain mental activity right now. Perception. That's it. Similarly, a concept does not necessarily imply truth. If we say a bachelor is an unmarried man, then the concept bachelor now becomes dependent on our language. And it depends on our conventions, right? So if we conventionally use the word bachelor to refer to those male human beings who are still unmarried, then if we meet the conventions of that language, then we will properly refer to those unmarried men as bachelors in that language. Do you see that? See how concepts become a function of language at that point? Because it's symbolic. You see that? All right. Why is this all relevant? So, just to summarize, when we think of ideas, you should think of psychology. That's your psyche, your soul active. Your soul is engaging in the activity of perception. That's what an idea is. When you think of concepts, you should think of an abstraction. No one has ever seen a bachelor, but it is a concept. You don't see bachelors, right? Do you see what I'm saying by you don't see bachelors? You never perceive them. Do you understand what I mean? But you can think about them using this artificial stuff called concepts. Concepts, unlike ideas, are definitional abstractions. Concepts don't talk about this apple in front of me. They talk about things like fruits. You see that? You can define what a fruit is as an abstraction away from the concrete fruit, and then give a very general definition that covers all classes of fruits. So you need to find only those qualities that are common to all fruits, bananas, oranges, and apples, and then define it at that abstract level. You never perceive these things called fruits. You've never seen a fruit. All that you've seen is a particular apple. You see what I'm saying? But you've never technically seen a fruit. Now, metaphysics gets interesting because some metaphysicians, people like Aristotle and Plato, would suggest, okay, a fruit is what we call the universal. So all you see is particular trees, but some metaphysicians say, in addition to those particular trees, there is this one ideal metaphysical tree. You know what I mean? Capital T-R-E-E. See what I'm saying? And that's a conceptual abstraction which some metaphysicians call real. In fact, they might even say that's the real tree, and all the particular trees are kind of imitating or participating in that ideal tree. All right, finally, guys, this thing called facts, Alessandra is absolutely right. There's something about the word fact that implies truth. But I want you to pay close attention to that little trick. Because people will speak to you and try to convince you of something by presenting what they say as what? Facts, right? That's a rhetorical move. It's just a fact that God is dead. It's just a fact that we were evolved from apes. It's a fact that this world is made of nothing but matter. It's a fact. It's a scientific fact that men have more testosterone than women. So let's compare these three words: facts, concepts, and ideas. First of all, ideas are subjective, right? Relative to the person. Concepts are not. Concepts are these symbols that we generate to manipulate all the data that's so rich in our perceptions that we can't manage it all. So we oversimplify and we create general categories in concepts. Facts, I want to suggest to you, are conventions that we have created consensus about. You see what I'm saying? We have certain societies or institutions over time that have reached a consensus, maybe not unanimity, it's not unanimous, but for the most part, most scientists now agree that there are, 120 chemical elements? Most scientists now agree that there are 5 different biological phyla or phyla. Or most scientists now agree that the Earth goes around the sun. So that agreement is all that they have going for themselves. You see what I'm saying? They will tell you that it's a fact that the Earth goes around the sun, or it's a fact that God doesn't exist. But when they do that, they are not proving themselves to you by stating that fact. They are just assuming. You see what I'm saying? They're taking a certain attitude towards it, and they're getting, the fact is getting its credibility from the fact that it's presented a certain way. So, why am I bringing this up? Well, a lot of things in educational institutions like universities are presented as facts, right? You've got statistical reports, you've got all sorts of experiments, and then you've got these peer-reviewed academic journals. All I'm trying to tell you is that when something is presented as a fact, all that really, really means is that a bunch of people within a certain academic or professional group have largely agreed on something and excluded all exceptions and disagreements, and they've kind of doubled down on it. You know what I mean? They've kind of refused to entertain further doubt, or they've suspended doubt for right now. They've said, until different evidence emerges, we think it's a fact that the Earth goes around the sun. Until further scientific evidence emerges, we think that psychics and the magicians and witches do not exist, or they're all con and fake. You know what I'm saying? So I want you to really appreciate, you hear these words, ideas, concepts, and facts all the time, but I want you to, in the philosophy class, you gotta be really careful about this. So when you hear the word idea, think of psychological perception. When you hear the word concept, think of definitional abstractions. And when you think of the word fact, don't think truth. That's what they want you to think. Instead, think conventional consensus. It means somewhere, at some point, some institution in our society, typically one with a lot of authority and expertise and a lot of credibility and reputation, they simply said, Christ was risen on Easter, and it becomes a fact, right? Now, do you see how that's someone's authority at some point in history that made it a fact? Christianity is the only religion. Well, if they're presenting it to you as a fact, think of their authority and think of their consensus among themselves. You see what I'm trying to get you to be sensitive to? Maybe technically there are no facts, guys, especially for someone who does critical thinking. You know what I mean? You're going to be very sensitive to what's typical and also all the exceptions. You see what I'm saying? That's when critical thinking is really happening. But scientists can be slothful too. They can be dogmatic and lazy. And when they start agreeing with each other, maybe they're doing that the same way a bunch of lawyers do when they form a bar, right? You have an interest in agreeing with one another and excluding people who disagree. You see how that's now political and no longer interested in truth? Guys, that was a nice little exercise. So let's get into the scientific Socratic method. Okay, guys, so the story I told you about Socrates was this heroic story, right? Like Socrates was just on fire for saving his fellow Athenians and his fellow Greeks and even the world. When he looks around him, he sees a bunch of sloths and a bunch of distracted people. He's like, man, you care about stuff that you shouldn't even be caring about. You care about money and politics and being a great carpenter and all that. And that's fine, but there's something much more important you should be caring about. You have something metaphysical in you, a soul. How can you spend all day training for the Olympics when you've got this soul you need to care for? And the proper care for the soul leads to a kind of excellence, an excellence called virtue. So Socrates taught that we should care for our souls, and if we care for them properly, it will bring out that aspect of the soul that is excellent in character. That's called our virtues. So that was true, what I told you. And that by itself makes Socrates revolutionary. The people before him were metaphysicians. He focused on ethics, how we should live our lives. But that's not enough. That's not enough to do honor to Socrates. Technically, guys, Socrates invented the blueprint for the scientific method. And that's why you might call it the Socratic scientific method. So I'm going to walk you through what the Socratic method is, and then you'll be able to see for yourself how parallel it is to the scientific method. So let's go through it. This is what's on display right now. F, the Socratic scientific method. First thing you do when you're doing the Socratic scientific method is you identify a problem or pose a question. Right? That's what Socrates does. And that's what we do in science, right? Now, what do you do here? You ask, what makes something an X? Or, in virtue of what is something an X? Or, how is it logically possible for something to be an X? What is the logical relationship between X and Y? Then your next step, after you've identified the question and formulated it as clearly and precisely as possible, both for Socrates and the scientists, the next step is the same. You use your current level of intelligence and imagination and intuition, and you hazard, you risk a guess. It's not a random guess, but an educated guess. The name for this guess is a hypothesis. So you propose a hypothesis. In proposing the hypothesis, guys, what you do is you specify the necessary or sufficient conditions for applying the concept in question, or for producing a particular result if you're doing a scientific experiment. So what you try to do is you try to identify the features shared by all and only those things to which the concept applies, or which would produce all and only those results that you expect from the experiment. So this is an exercise in your intellect. This is an intellectual activity. And Socrates invented this. After we go through this, I'm going to give you a classic example of how Socrates applied this in one of his dialogues called the Euthyphro. So next, after you propose a hypothesis, right? Up till this point in history, guys, every philosopher had been doing this. They found a problem. What is really real? Or how do I explain change in the world, right? And they gave some sort of hypothesis. But they were dogmatic, and they didn't just treat it as a hypothesis, they treated it as a dogmatic thesis. When you make a hypothesis, you're saying from the outside, look, this is tentative. I don't know if this is right or wrong. I have to test it first. If it passes the test, then it can become a thesis or even a theory, okay? So the next step is derive a test implication. Test your hypothesis. So you ask, what if this hypothesis were true? What are the implications of this hypothesis being true? What does it commit us to? And test implications have the form, if hypothesis H is true, then concept X should apply in this situation. Or for the scientific experimental version, if hypothesis H is true, then we expect these results and not these, okay? So the next step is, once you have the hypothesis and you say, if this hypothesis is true, we expect these results, then you actually run the experiment. You perform the test. You determine whether the concept applies in the situation envisioned. And so guys, if you mix two chemicals, and before you mix them, you say, if it's true that this is chemical A and this is chemical B, then based on my previous experience with these two chemicals, I'm going to make a hypothesis that if I mix these two chemicals, I should get a substance with a perception. I perceive this new idea should be a certain color, shape, size, smell, and taste. All right, so you make the test before you do the experiment. Then you do the experiment, and if it confirms what you predicted, you've just confirmed your hypothesis. If you get something different, you have to do step number 5, which is you either accept or reject the hypothesis. If the concept applies in the situation envisioned, there is reason to believe that it is true. Now, what do we mean by applied, guys? Do you see why I did that exercise earlier about facts, concepts, and ideas? If you're running a real experiment, what are you actually looking at during the experiment? Those are perceptions. You see that? Ideas. What are you doing when you're building a hypothesis? That is purely conceptual. You see that? You're defining things a certain way and then looking at the implications of those concepts for the real world. So you test your concepts and your definitions through examples that are purely ideas. Do you see that? And then if you do this long enough and everybody in the world does the same experiment and everybody agrees, then you no longer have a concept or an idea. You have that third thing called what? Got it. Now that's how facts are generated. All right? So if the concept applies in the situation envisioned, there is reason to believe that it is true. If it doesn't apply, there is reason to believe it is false. In that case, you should either reject the hypothesis or go back to step number 2, propose a different hypothesis, and try again. You see that? Very elegant process. Socrates, guys, is the Socratic method. He's applying this process, but just in dialogue with people. I'm going to give you an example. So there's this famous dialogue of Plato called the Euthyphro. And he talks about how Socrates is going to court because he's been indicted. And he meets a priest on the way there. The priest's name is Euthyphro. And as they're talking, he finds out that Euthyphro also is in legal troubles, but unlike Socrates, who's being indicted, Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father. And you know Socrates, right? Now he's like, whoa, this is a priest who's prosecuting his own father. So not only is it the same legal trouble as me, but this is now almost a religious issue. How can you prosecute your own father, right? This is almost like, back in that culture, that would be almost like impious, you know what I mean? A lack of respect and reverence for your father. So how does it go, guys? Well, this is how it goes. So Socrates is like, oh my God, if you are prosecuting your own father, you must know a whole lot about law and a whole lot about piety. If you're confident enough to do that, you need to teach me. But of course, Socrates is being ironic at this point, right? His real intention is not so much to learn from Euthyphro about piety, but the reverse, to show that even a priest might not know exactly what piety is if he starts defining terms properly and carefully. You see that? So Socrates is this historical agent, not only a hero who reinvented philosophy as ethical rather than metaphysical. He's also this amazing person in the history of knowledge as someone who gave us a method for finding and testing knowledge. And that method is analogous to the scientific method. You see that? Here's what's going to happen. So Socrates says, oh, okay, Euthyphro, you're a priest and everything, so clearly you must have some idea of what piety is. You know, people would say, take your own father to court, that's impious. But, you know, I mean, you're a priest, you tell me, you know, what is piety? All right, so what did I just say? What is piety? Can you see number one? We've already started. Number one. What is number one? Identify a problem or pose a question. So Socrates has begun the Socratic method. What is piety? All right. Now he's dealing with a priest. So he's playing with him a little bit because he's like, look, I need to shut up and be quiet. You're a priest. Most of us associate piety with godliness. So clearly you're going to school me, right? And then he says again, so what is piety, Euthyphro? And Euthyphro confidently says, what I'm doing is piety. And then Socrates says, exactly what are you doing? He says, to prosecute my own father, regardless of whether or not he's my father, simply because he did something wrong. To do that kind of thing, that is piety, that is godliness. Oh, okay. So Socrates says, that's very nice, very good, but it is insufficient. That is not what I was asking you. What you gave me, Euthyphro, is not a general standard by which I can tell whether anything is piety or not. That would be called a definition, right? A definition is something that once you have it, you can test everything that you have in your perceptions, whether or not it meets that conceptual standard. Do you see that? Are you following me? Socrates is asking for a definition of piety, but the priest Euthyphro is giving him an example. You see how an example is not only different from a definition, but it's substandard? An example will only give you one instance, one type. But a concept is abstract. You see that? A concept is supposed to give you some idea of the necessary and sufficient conditions for a thing to be what it is. Do you see that? So for anything that qualifies as piety, regardless of its difference from other things, for so long as it qualifies as piety, then the definition should be able to process it and say, yes, this counts as piety. So the definition is not the same as the example. The definition is the standard used to test the example. You see that? Is everyone clear on that? All right, so Euthyphro is overconfident. He's like, look, if you want piety, if you want to know what piety is, look at me. I'm prosecuting my own dad, someone I love, but because he did wrong, I'm prosecuting him because that's what the gods want. This is true piety, man. Prosecute your own father, independent of how you feel about him. If he does something wrong, take him to court. And Socrates is rather impressed. It's like, that shows some ethical quality, but in terms of knowledge, this is substandard. What you gave me, Euthyphro, is an example. I want something more like a definition. Something like that will tell me the essence of piety, the necessary and sufficient conditions that must be met by anything that is pious. You see that? So that any example, regardless of its differences from any other example, if it qualifies as piety, then the definition should show you that clearly. So then he says, no, that's not good enough. Try again. Give me a definition of piety. And then Euthyphro thinks, he says, I got it. Whatever the gods love, whatever the gods hold dear, that is pious, or that is piety. And then Socrates says, aha, now we're on the right track. That is what we were calling a definition, all right? So now we've transitioned from the problem, and Socrates has accepted Euthyphro's hypothesis. Euthyphro, do you see how Euthyphro has just made a hypothesis? He's given a definition. It's provisional, it's tentative. We don't know if it's accurate yet, but it has the right form. It has that definitional abstraction form. You see that? Not an example, but an actual necessary and sufficient conditions form, an essence form. All right. So Socrates is a bit excited because he thinks we're gonna go deep here and make some progress. So then he says, now Socrates, us being Greeks and everything, you say that what's pious is whatever is loved by the gods. But we have these things called legends and myths. And in our legends and myths, up on Olympus and in heaven, the gods fight with each other and they disagree. They actually value different things. So what is Socrates doing now? When he makes that remark, he is now deriving a test implication. Do you see that? What he's saying is, okay, you say that to be pious is to be loved by the gods or dear to the gods. Now, Socrates is saying, okay, let's look at the full background to our theology. He says, our gods are in conflict with one another, and they're in conflict with one another because they value different things. So what one god loves, the other god hates, and vice versa. Different things are dear to different gods. What Zeus values is different what Poseidon values, and what Hera and Athena and Artemis and Aphrodite value. They all value different things. So he's saying that if your hypothesis were true, if it were true, step number 3, derive a test implication. If it were true, what you're saying, that what's dear to the gods is what makes something pious, then if that were true, given our theological background, that would mean that what's pious would be both what's dear to the gods and what's not dear to them. Do you see that? Because depending on each god, you would have reversals of values. That's test implication. And then you perform the test. Well, performing the test is easy, right? If piety is both what's loved and hated by the gods, you have a contradiction, right? Piety cannot be both what's loved and hated by the gods. Or in other words, piety is what's loved by the gods cannot be both true and false at the same time. Do you see that? All right. So that's the test. Test to see if it generates a problem, like a contradiction. That's the test. And so now, at that point, you have to move on. Either you accept the hypothesis or you reject it and you revise, go back to proposing a new hypothesis. And that's exactly what they do for the rest of the dialogue. You have a better idea now of what the Socratic method looks like and how it's related to the scientific method? That's what scientists do. All right? All right. All right, let's move to Hume. We've got 5 minutes, but I think we can do it. And we can continue next class. But I needed to set that up. Okay. All right, guys. So it's in this context that we have a breakthrough in epistemology. Remember what we said epistemology is, right? It's a theory of knowledge, how we know things. Hume makes a breakthrough, such a deep breakthrough in how we know things, that he shows that the kinds of things people pretend to know in metaphysics cannot be known. And that's how you discredit it, right? You simply cut it down at the foundation. The kinds of things and the kind of epistemology required for you to know the things that you claim to know, you don't have, and none of us has. But guess what? As I said, historically, that story was fatal for metaphysics. But if properly understood, it should also have been fatal or at least very problematic for science as well, based on what we talked about, concepts, facts, and ideas. But you know what, guys? We have plenty of time next class, so I think we're going to go ahead and end here. No use rushing it. Next class, read the Chisholm, and then we'll have plenty of time. We'll go directly into Hume next time, and it'll be nice because then in one lesson, we'll integrate Hume into the problems that will come with free will, determinism, and something called compatibilism, which is the idea that free will and determinism can both be true at the same time. All right, guys. So I'm just going to take attendance, and that's the end of class. It was very nice seeing you, and I look forward to our next class.